Welcome to the CLB Forge podcast. This is the show to help equip you and your church for mission, ministry, and multiplying disciples. Here are your hosts, Pastor Mike Natal and Dr. Ryan Nilsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 52. We're excited to have you here. We have kind of an interesting episode for you because it's another one of those webinars that Ryan recorded for the Church of the Lutheran Brethren. And so, Ryan, I'm going to give you a chance to intro what our listeners are either going to listen to or what our watchers are going to be watching on YouTube.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. We had a great webinar with Pastor Erick Sorensen about how to have spiritual conversations. And Mike and I were both there, really enjoyed it. You're going to learn some great basics about how you as a ministry leader can be involved, how you can have conversations with people you meet in everyday life, but more importantly, how you can guide and lead others in your church to do the same.
Yeah, 100%. I really enjoyed the webinar that Eric took time in order to do. I would encourage people that if you're listening to this, you're not really going to miss much, but Eric did a really good job with a slideshow. And so if you're able to watch it on YouTube, I would definitely recommend doing that. You're not going to miss too much. He does a great job of following his slides and explaining what he's looking at. And he uses, the best form of literary, what's the word that I'm looking for? What's alliteration considered, Ryan? Literary what?
Crime?
No, alliteration is great. In fact, I think that maybe we could have like a channel poll for our podcast and ask people what's your take on alliteration? Do you love it?
Yeah.
Do you have a great deal of disdain towards it, like my fellow co-host Ryan Nilsson? Or are you just like, yeah, whatever, using the same letter to start the words? It's not really that exciting. But yeah, let us know in the comments.
I think I'm going to start the Anti-Alliteration Association of America.
See, you already did it without even realizing it. You can't not speak without using alliteration. It's just natural.
Oh.
So
anyway, yeah. Thanks, Mike. Thank you for introing that. I think this is going to be a great episode. Just a heads up to our YouTube viewers. Pastor Erick's video, we had some issues with his video about halfway through. So the close-up videos of Erick stop about halfway through, but all the content's still there. All the audio is still there. But that's why we suddenly switched to like the Zoom gallery view. Anyway, so just a word of caution on that. Otherwise, enjoy the webinar.
Enjoy.
Well, welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here today. Thanks for joining us here for this webinar about having spiritual conversations. I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Erick Sorensen. He's a pastor at Hillside Lutheran Brethren Church in Succossona, New Jersey, and works with 1517. And he's going to be talking to us today, sharing some different ways that we can have spiritual conversations with people that we interact with, and ways that we can equip ourselves for that. So thank you so much, Erick. I think this is a critical skill and practice that we and people in our churches should engage in. But it's more important than ever during COVID, when so many other ways that we rely on to engage in ministry and engage in conversation are so much restricted. This has been an area that's easy for us to ignore and not pay attention to. And I think one of the things that God is doing in this time is helping us focus on what's truly important. So, Pastor Erick, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being with us today.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. And thanks for having me. I think most of you probably know certainly a bit about my background and, where I'm coming from. I planted Epiphany Church in Manhattan, and a lot of what I'm going to share with you today is born out of that experience. Obviously, lots and lots of I could go on and on about mistakes that were made, but through trial and error, I think I hope anyway, I gleaned some things about what it looks like to actually start having conversations with people about spiritual matters and how that can look. I always give this disclaimer whenever I talk about this issue, that what I'm going to say here is by far and away not the only way that one can go about this. This is just my own personal experience, and it's how God chose to use me in the midst of Manhattan when we were initially planting the church. Just a little background about that. I mean, basically for the first year and a half, we didn't really have a core group of people. And so that meant that we had to find those people. And the way we did that is I basically went out every day for, basically treated it like a job, 8 hours a day. I would go and just try and talk to strangers. And so I'd walk up to people at cafes, et cetera, and try to get things going that way. It's not easy to do that, and it involves a lot of prayer. It involves a lot of ability to deal with rejection and all that sort of thing. But again, through that experience, I feel like I gleaned some things, and hopefully what I have to share with you today is helpful to that end in your own ministries and in your own lives. I do want to say, feel free during this conversation to actually make it a conversation. If you have a question in the midst of something that I'm saying that you want clarification about, that's totally fine. I feel much more comfortable conversing than lecturing at you. So if there's anything that you have questions about or comments about, don't hesitate to ask, and I'm happy to be interrupted and to dig a little further into a particular issue or a particular concept. So with that, I mean, I have created an actual presentation for this, just because I've been asked to talk about this a number of times. And so I'm going to, if I can, share a screen with you so that you can basically follow along with me with some of the content that I'm going to go over today. So basically, I have thought about 5 to not only encourage ourselves to engage with people on the outside of the faith, or engage with people that are not in the church, but I hope 5 ways that the people that we serve and the people that we minister to also can do that. And so I'd like to share that with you now. First of all, and you're going to notice every bubble here is super cheesy. It's all like, the same, every word begins with the same letter and all that stuff. I don't apologize for it. I realize what it is. Corny is fine as long as it helps you maybe remember something. So the first part of the talk is called Cultivating Conversation Commencers. Insanely creative, I know. You must be filled with admiration. But what am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about, as we do outreach, how do we become people that actually learn to start conversations well? What do we do in that process so that we're not just doing what I think the church is very, very much prone to doing, which is we opened our doors and anybody's welcome. Maybe put a sign out on the front, of the church that said all are welcome here. But essentially the program for much of the church is we're going to wait until they come to our thing, to our service. Or maybe we put on an event and we send out flyers, or we, do some social media advertising, hoping that they'll come to us. But as I look at what Jesus instructed his disciples to do, he did not, in fact, instruct them to do that. Not that that's wrong, but there's a very active participation component to it. It's go, go, go. It is, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. There is this expectation that disciples of Jesus will go to the world with the message he's given us to deliver. And so, again, inviting people to your event, inviting people to your church, I think is great. And I have a section about that in here that I think it's a very worthy thing. But I don't want it to be only that thing. How do we begin the conversation with people? This is the question I get asked all the time. How do we even start? Well, the first thing I'd say is, if you're looking to do outreach and talk to people, the first thing you should do, besides pray, which is obviously the very first thing you should do, start to think about where third places are. Now, what's a third place? I think probably most of you are familiar with this. Starbucks back in the day came up with the terminology of them being the third place that people would go in their life. That was their goal. I don't know that that's their goal anymore as much. I really don't. But I know in the beginning, their hope was that a person, the average person in America, has their home, they have their, and then they have a place that they might go to hang out. That's the third place. Starbucks, when it started and when it was really booming, really tried hard to create an atmosphere in which they could be that third place that people would feel comfortable going. And they were enormously successful at it. They created an environment in which people felt comfortable to hang out, have conversation, and just be with one another. Now it's more difficult because everybody brings their laptop, puts in their headphones, and immediately signals to the rest of the world, leave me alone. But I remember when Starbucks was really growing that there really was this active sort of conversational feel to the place at the get-go. And so ask yourself, what are the places that people actually hang out at in your area? Where do people go where they wouldn't be shocked if someone actually came up and said hello to them? They wouldn't feel like they were accosted if somebody came up and said, hey, my name's Eric. I have a question for you. There's obviously a lot of places where that would not be appropriate. But there are places where people wouldn't be stunned. What are those places where you live? What kinds of hobbies, networks, groups exist in your area that you might naturally be a part of, or that you might consider joining so that you have a chance to actually get to know your neighbors better? I'm a father of 3 kids. All of them have been involved in various sports. It's the most natural environment ever. You've got a bunch of parents that, for the most part, unless they're really obsessed with their kids' particular sport, have a lot of time to just hang out and talk, and you get to know people. It's very natural for parents to talk at events like that. What are those kinds of things in your area? What are those kinds of things that probably already exist in your life, that are interests that you have, that would lend that conversation would be very natural, very easy to participate in? Who are the movers and shakers in your area? Who are the people that are actually influencing what happens? And I'm not talking about federal things. I'm talking about the local level. Who are the people that are involved in making decisions for how things go in your neighborhood, in your community? Are there ways to access those people and to develop conversations with them, to introduce yourself, especially if you're a clergyman, that you could go up to them and talk to them and it would feel very natural. In the town that I minister in Succossana, New Jersey now, there is a place locally, and Janet Spencer, who's part of this call, can vouch for this, that you kind of know you can go anytime and there will be people hanging out there that are very, very connected into the community. And that place is called Brian's Luncheonette. And Brian's is, you'll find the mayor there. You'll find I'll find a ton of church members there on a regular basis. I don't think I've ever gone there and not seen a church member there. It's not anything fancy, but it's just a place that that you could strike up conversation with any number of people. It's a connecting place for people to gather. And so the point of all this is you're just seeking to find places where people expect to have some level of interaction. That's the goal here. That's the first thing I would say. Look for natural places where people would expect to have conversation. All right. Moving on from that, learn and think about how to ask questions. That the Christian church in America has almost always tended to lead with preaching at people and coming to them with a message, especially when it comes to evangelism. Evangelism programs are almost a lot of the time very pre-packaged. It feels very robotic. I won't mention any in particular by name, but they're almost like you almost have to learn a script in order to begin a conversation with somebody. What I'm advocating for here is getting away from that approach and actually trying to be yourself, to be a human. I can remember having people walk up to me, having Christians, well-meaning Christians, walk up to me in the mall in Southern California when I was a teenager And, they would begin the conversation like something like, I'm thinking off the top of my head, it's like, hello, do you like hot and spicy things? And you're like, yes, I do. And they're like, well, hell is going to be hot and spicy for you one day. It was like, what on earth is going on right now? And it was just this very uncomfortable, very unnatural. You could tell they weren't comfortable. You could tell you felt uncomfortable, but they were just sort of like doing what they thought they were told to do, go evangelize. And so find something common, hot and spicy. I'm trying to advocate for getting away from that, because I'm convinced if we approach people preaching at them, most will tune us out. If you think about it, the average person in America is being preached at with 1,000 different sermons every day, with every commercial they hear, every advertisement they come across on Facebook, every political post they come across. They are being preached 1 million sermons a year. What they don't get a lot of the time is people actually interested in hearing from them and actually listening to them. And so my approach is to come to people with humility and actually engage in real conversation. So as an example, something that I would do is I might come up to somebody and say, excuse me, I'm from Epiphany Church, and I'm just trying to get to know my neighbors a little bit more. Would you mind if I ask you a few questions? Now, in Manhattan, you would expect that people would, tell me to take a hike. In fact, about 75% of the time, most people said, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk. The 25% of the time, people would basically tell me to take a hike. But a lot of the time, people were actually kind of willing to engage in conversation if you didn't take too long. If you especially say at the beginning, just like a few minutes of your time, just to ask you a few questions to get to know my neighbors a little better. What kinds of things would I ask? Well, I'd begin with simple questions: your name, where you're from, social security number, bank account number. No, but I would say, where you're from. Where are you from originally? An important question, because in Manhattan, most people were not from there. What do you do to keep yourself busy? What do you do for fun? Favorite movie, favorite music? Small talk stuff. But then I would always inevitably get to 3 very important questions. The first question I would ask somebody is, what most gives you hope? If you can narrow down one thing for me, what most gives you hope in this world? Now, admittedly, when I would bring up that question, there would be a little like, ooh, there'd be a shift, because all of a sudden it was like, oh, you're asking me to do some introspective stuff. This is more of a heavy question you're asking me. But again, almost every time, people would happily give me an answer. And those answers, you can only imagine how far they would range. But I'd get in family, my friends, my girlfriend, Bernie, Biden, whatever. I never got Trump, at the time I was starting. Trump was running for president. He wasn't particularly popular in Manhattan, as you might imagine. But yeah, you get all sorts of answers for what most gave people hope. Secondly, I would ask the question, what gives you a sense of dread or hopelessness? And I'd ask them to narrow down one thing. What most gives you a sense of dread or hopelessness? What do you feel like, just no matter what we do, it just doesn't seem like it can be fixed? Where I was at in Manhattan, the question was, often answered with climate change. People were very, very concerned about that, and just felt like nothing could be done to fix it. And then the third question I would ask is, what do you think of humanity? Good, bad, somewhere in between. What's your view of humanity? Now, why would I ask those questions? Well, the reason I would ask those questions is because what I found is the answers that were given would very often lend themselves to much deeper discussion. So if somebody said, I have hope in my family, I could say, well, why do you say that? And they'd happily dig into their answer. They'd happily share. It's amazing how much people actually, if they have the sense that somebody wants to listen to them, how much people actually like to talk about themselves and how much people like to talk about their life. And what I'm being given through them just sharing is a bit of a window into their worldview. And so I'm figuring out as I'm listening to them, and I would actually have a notebook with me. I would write down their answers and write down things they said. I'm being given an opportunity to then address things through the lens of the gospel that that I wouldn't have known about apart from those questions. So there's a diagnostic sense to these questions. Now, again, sometimes it wouldn't go very deep at all, but other times we'd really be able to dive into some very important issues. And so that's what you could develop your own questions. There's any number of ways you could do it, but I'm just giving you an example of how I would begin the conversation. Now, second way that we could do outreach is, in fact, doing what I talked about at the very beginning. It's good to invite people. It's good to invite people to what we do and to the things that we put on as a church. And we should encourage our people, especially if your pastor's watching this, to be inviters. John 1:43 through 51, the story of Philip and Nathanael is sort of the template for this. As much as I can say, Jesus didn't just set us up to be a church that waits for people to come to us. At the same time, there is a reality that most of our people are probably not equipped to be apologists, to answer the great philosophical questions. Most of our people that are in our churches, and frankly, even most of us here, whether we're pastors or whatever we do, leaders in our churches, we probably don't have all the answers either. A lot of us are like Philip. You remember Philip comes to Nathanael, says, "I've met the Messiah." And Nathanael, and it turns out the Messiah is from Nazareth. And Nathanael's like, "Say that again." And Philip says, "Yeah, he's from Nazareth." And Nathanael, of course, says, "Nothing good comes out of Nazareth." And what does Philip do? Philip doesn't try to give a great apologetic for why it is in fact the case that the Messiah could come from somewhere as dumpy as Nazareth. No. He just says, "Will you just come and see?" That's literally his approach. Just come and see with me. And then when Nathanael goes and sees, in fact, he meets Christ and his life is changed. So we want to encourage our people to be people that aren't afraid to invite their friends and their family to our events, to church, where they can indeed encounter Christ themselves. So the beauty of this really doesn't take any training, no equipping, just a willingness of people to ask, "Will you come to this?" There is a stat that I have come across that is just, frankly, it's brutal to me. 96% of non-church people said they would consider going to church if they were invited. 96%. Only 21% of active churchgoers invite anyone to church in the course of a year. Only 2% of church members ever invite an unchurched person to church. 2%. That's an insane statistic. But if Tom Ranier is right, then that means an awful lot of our people come to church. Very few, if any, actually invite people to church. That doesn't take equipping. It just takes encouragement. Encouragement from up front to say, invite. Right now, it's on social media. For a lot of our churches, share this on Facebook or wherever. But it's about being visible and encouraging those people to invite. Now, here's the catch about inviting people to a church service or to a church event. Oftentimes, the reason people don't invite, or it can be the case, is that they're embarrassed to invite their friends to church. They're afraid of what the preacher is going to say, or they're afraid of the music being poor quality. That is a reality. And so the risk that you take in encouraging people to invite their friends and family to church, and the reason that they may not is because they're a little embarrassed about what could happen when they go to church. I'm being totally real here. That's a painful thing, I think, for many of us, especially when we're in smaller churches and we just don't have the funds, we don't have the resources, we don't have the people or the manpower to produce something amazing. But I'm pointing out that this is the reality sometimes, that people may not invite because they just don't feel like there's something that they feel comfortable inviting their friends to. Thirdly, we do want to make sure that we actually, when we do get the opportunity to share the gospel, that in fact, the gospel is actually what is shared. So, it's a great thing if Christians are engaging their neighbors and seeking to bring their neighbors to the faith and seeking to have those conversations. But if they present to them a message that is in fact not the gospel, then we may end up winning them to something that we don't want them won to. We want them won to Jesus Christ. Now, you've all heard of this, I would imagine, the Romans Road, but even equipping people with just this very simple sort of formula can be at least a helpful way of making sure that when they do get the opportunity to actually share the message, that they actually share the message, something else, not their politics, not their moral persuasion about this, that, or the other thing, but that in fact, no, they actually are getting to the point. I won't harp on this much longer because I think most people here know the gospel and are very much aware of that. And so I don't need to explain this much further. But the Romans Road is a fine way. Is it cliche? Maybe. Like, who cares? It's true. It's sort of like saying, what you're going to quote John 3:16 because it's too quoted. So what? It's great. It's the heart. Quote it again. Keep things simple. Thirdly, or fourthly, I should say, don't be afraid to train people and to think in terms of your own testimony. Now, I realize that for many of us, and I think especially in more Reformation tradition type churches, the testimony, because of problems that have been associated with it, can be resisted, or can be seen as almost a bad thing to encourage people to do. I would say, yes, there's dangers. Yes. True. I'll address that. But especially in our age where, we are living in an age with sort of the fruits of postmodernism hanging all around us in people's minds, one's testimony actually can be maybe taken more seriously initially by someone that you're speaking to than almost anything else. It's just a reality. People are just, part of what postmodernism emphasizes is the power of one's individual story. It's so central to the way of thinking. And people can't, they might not care about the story, but they can't deny the story. You go to people with apologetics, for example, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and I don't devalue at all. As I initially started to in New York City, I would try and begin conversations with a very apologetic approach, looking at the evidence for Christianity and the evidence for why we believe it. And I would find that people would say, "Oh, okay, yeah, you've got your evidence, but the fact is you're appealing to history. And how do I know that I can trust the history? History is written by the winners. History is written by the people with power. How do I know I can trust that?" And all of a sudden you're dealing in epistemological categories where you have to go even further back to is there any such thing as truth? Can we verify truth? And now you're getting into philosophical categories that take a long time to unpack. I want to get to the point as soon as we can. I want to get to Jesus as soon as we can. I don't want to force it, but I don't want to get bogged down in the philosophical minutiae either. Again, I'll advocate for apologetics in just a second. But the beauty of testimony is it highlights personal experience, which most people are most comfortable sharing. And it can be quite moving and elicit curiosity in the hearer. I used to be a drunk or used to be a drug addict. Jesus met me and delivered me from that. It is the fact that the most powerful video Epiphany Church ever made is by a guy named Isaiah, who was an addict and a drug dealer, who Jesus met at our church and transformed his life and his marriage and everything. It is a powerful, moving testimony. It's fine to encourage people to do that. At the same time, the danger of testimonies is that it can focus too much on one's self and not enough on Jesus. As all of you know, testimonies can often be filled with exaggeration for the point of dramatic emphasis. And so a person can get up there and the way they talk about their former addiction is just like, oh, I was the worst person ever. And then I met Jesus and now I'm the best person ever. And everything is great and hunky-dory and I feel great. And don't you want what I have? Listen, we don't want to build false expectations. And that's sometimes what testimonies can be in danger of doing. So acknowledging the danger of that, I think we can encourage people to give the right kind of testimony, which I would say is to be vulnerable, to be real and honest. We encourage us to be honest sinners rather than fully sanctified saints, which I think is the downside of testimonies a lot of the time. And then simply state what difference Jesus makes. Instead of focusing on how Jesus fixed your moral behavior, how about Jesus gave a sinner like me forgiveness and hope that there's a better life to come? Yay! That's a much better program in my mind than become like me, a better guy than you. All right, and the final way, and then I'll stop for some conversation and some engagement because we're getting pretty close to it. As much as I can say, apologetics can be overrated or overwrought, I think it is very important. And I do want to encourage people to be familiar with how to defend their faith. Now, I think there's really two main ways you can go about it that I think can, at least foster conversation. One is you can argue for the truthfulness of Christianity by starting at creation, the fact that the universe seems to be designed, or the fact that anything exists at all, which is kind of the cosmological argument, or the fact that there's an inherent morality that everyone knows is there. This was C.S. Lewis's one of his great arguments. You could go that route, and I think that's fine. You can encourage people to do that. You could go also for the arguments for the resurrection, which I'm more privy to, and certainly the organization I work with, 1517, is very privy to. Which is arguing from the validity of starting with the historical reliability of the New Testament Gospels, and then moving out from there to the reliability of the rest of the scriptures, and then making your case for the reliability of Jesus's truthfulness from that point. You can rely on the fact that, what else accounts for the growth and of the early church, while at the same time the willingness of all of Jesus's disciples to be martyred for their insistence that he had really rose from the dead. You can talk about the fact that we know there were hundreds of people that claimed to see the risen Christ, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. So these are evidences that you can point to that will foster conversation. At least to ask somebody like, well, what would be your objection to this evidence? What would you say in response to this? Completely fine to go that way. Again, problems with apologetic approach. This is just what I found. Most of our friends and neighbors aren't as astute in their arguments against the faith as one might think. You sort of get, I think, apologetics courses sort of train you to be ready to deal with, the Sam Harrises or the Richard Dawkins of the world. And then you get out there in the world and you figure out that 99% of people are not thinking about anything close to Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, these famous atheists, but in fact are actually fairly open to spirituality. Most people are actually consider themselves believers in some sort of deity, that they don't have a problem with the idea of the supernatural. Most people believe, if you ask them, most people will tell you they've had experiences they can't explain, and they might attribute it to ghosts or they might attribute it to something spiritual, but you will find vast majority of people actually are open to spiritual matters. For most, the reasons they reject Christianity are emotional. They're not intellectual. And I can't emphasize this enough. Even if they give you an intellectual argument for why they say they resist it, dig a little deeper, scratch a little deeper, you will find that almost always it comes down to something emotional rather than intellectual. The intellectual argument given becomes the cover so they don't have to share the emotional pain or scars that they have. And then lastly, as I've already alluded to, current cultural climate doesn't seem to care all that much about logical contradictions in their worldview at all. And you can bring up the contradiction that they might have with logic or sound reasoning, and they can say, oh yeah, I guess that does contradict, and they'll just move on. A lot of the apologetics game is trying to show the inconsistencies in people's worldview. And we live in an age in which inconsistency is not seen as a weakness, but actually more often than not a strength. And so that's the danger of the apologetic approach. But that said, I think we should use it. I'm a big fan of it. It's just needs to be seen in its proper context here. So some resources for apologetics, I think that could be helpful for you. The Thinking Fellows podcast, which is something produced by 1517, has a lot on apologetics. And these, it's a podcast by guys that have actually done the work of apologetics for a long time, but they're pretty down to earth and I think pretty accessible for everybody. If you're looking for something that really delves into sort of the philosophical and psychological reasons for how one who is a modern person that has all their intellectual faculties in, running well, could in fact believe in God. Making Sense of God by Keller, it's a little heady. It's a little difficult to wrap your mind around, but actually it does a good job of laying out the philosophical categories for you to think through, be armed with as you engage people. The Reason for God by Keller is also very good. It's sort of, I think, maybe the gold standard for apologetics books that have been released in the last 25 years or so, 30 years, probably even back further. But Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis is a classic that never gets old. And I'd encourage you all, if you haven't read it recently, or maybe it's been a while, read it again. It's just so good, so encouraging to us as Christians. And then anything from James Sire is also very good. I know that those of you who went to the LB seminary know James Sire and remember that name, but he does a great job of interacting with the arguments and with the objections to Christianity that are out there in a very accessible way. His books are not long and they're, very, very easy to understand, to deal with. So that is, folks, 5 ways in which I encourage others to think through how to engage your neighbors with the gospel and to have spiritual conversations.
All right. Thank you so much, Pastor Erick, for that great webinar, that great conversation. It was great to be there and just so good to be able to share this on our podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So many things to retain and so many things that apply to our mission statement as the Forge. So definitely keep this one in your back pocket. It's one that should be revisited as people are understanding how to reach out to others, which is oftentimes something that people know they should do, but there's like a lost in translation thing that deters them from doing it. And so I think that it's great that we're sharing these things and that Erick is willing to share his experiences too, even some that maybe didn't go the perfect way that he expected. And that's one of the things that I love about Erick is just his willingness to be transparent for the gospel, which is what he does on a regular basis, which is great.
I think one of the things that really stood out to me, Mike, is just how oftentimes we will do one of these action, one of these strategy areas at a time. There's so much power in engaging in all of them at once. And so I just want to really encourage church leaders to think about ways to engage all these areas that Erick talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone and do something new too. So thanks also to our listeners. We're happy that you were able to be a part of this episode. Don't forget, we'd love it if you could share this podcast with either a colleague or a friend, or maybe even somebody in your church that you might think would benefit from hearing the things that Erick had to say. And so we thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.
This has been an episode of the CLB Forge podcast with Pastor Mike Natal and Dr. Ryan Nilsson. Thanks for listening. We welcome your questions and comments. Email us at podcast@clbforge.org.